She refused the handsome nobleman, and the quiet servant she chose turned out to be the Duke in disguise, though she did not know it yet on that pale autumn morning when the rain came down over Wexley Hall like a slow accusation, and the wind pressed itself against the tall windows with the patience of something that meant to stay. Autumn had arrived at Wexley Hall the way certain visitors arrive at country houses in the west of England, without announcement, without invitation, and without any intention of leaving before the last leaf had fallen. It did not knock. It did not scrape its boots on the stone at the servant's door. It simply moved into the corridors, into the drawing rooms, into the linen presses and the pantries and the cold hearths that had not yet been lit for the season, and it made itself at home. The gardeners hurried to cover the last of the roses. The housekeeper counted the woolens twice. The chandeliers were lowered on their long chains and dusted, and the crystal drops swung slightly, catching the gray light that came through the high windows, and the light itself seemed to hesitate, as if uncertain whether to enter a house that had, in recent months, so little joy in it. The house itself, in the way of houses that have stood 2 centuries, had begun to make the small sounds that houses make when they know they are being watched by their own weather. The faint tick of a floorboard adjusting to the damp, the low murmur of a window frame settling into its casement, the small sigh of a curtain lifted by a draught that had entered through no door anyone could name. In the kitchens below, the cook set a pan of water on to boil and did not look up when the copper on the wall trembled faintly against its hook. In the stables at the far side of the yard, the head groom, whose rheumatism was reliable to within a day of the coming rain, tightened the belt of his coat and told the boy to bring in the tack. In the small pantry off the servants' hall, a young under-housemaid counted the last of the summer's preserves and understood, without being told, that from tomorrow she would be sent to the linen cupboards, because linen was the season's work and preserves were the season's memory. Everywhere, all through the house, the small quiet transaction between Autumn and Wexley Hall was being conducted, and no one who lived under its roof had any share in the terms. In one of the upper rooms, in a chair pulled close to a window that faced east toward the long line of oaks along the drive, sat a young woman named Miss Clara Whitmore, and she was not looking at the oaks, and she was not looking at the rain, and she was not looking at the book that lay open on her lap. She was looking, without knowing she was looking, at the corner of the window frame where a small spider had begun, patiently, to build a web across the space between 2 panels of wood, and she thought, very quietly, that the spider was doing more useful work today than she was. Clara Whitmore was 23 years old, the second daughter of a country squire whose land had once been prosperous and was no longer, and she had lived in her father's house all her life, and until recently she had not been unhappy in it. She was of average height, of a slender frame that her mother had once described as insubstantial, with dark brown hair that she wore plainly braided and coiled at the nape of her neck, and gray eyes that people who did not know her called cool and people who did know her called patient. She had a face that did not draw attention in a crowded room. Her elder sister, Marianne, had a face that did. Marianne was tall and golden-haired and possessed a laugh that carried across ballrooms, and it had been decided, informally but firmly, by her mother and by the tenor of every visit from every neighbor for as long as Clara could remember, that Marianne was the sister who would make the family's fortune again through a good match, and Clara was the sister who would keep house, and read books, and be useful and remain. This had never been said aloud in the sharp sense that Clara felt it now. It had been said in the gentler sense of everyday arrangement, in the way she was the one who was called for when the linen inventory needed doing, and Marianne was the one who was called for when there was company in the drawing-room, and both of them, in their separate ways, had accepted the pattern without argument, because arguing with a pattern is like arguing with the weather. You may say your piece to it. It goes on doing what it does. But the pattern had begun, in the last 3 months, to press on Clara in a way it had not before, because Marianne had refused 3 suitors in a single summer, and their father, whose health was frailier than his pride would allow him to admit, had begun to speak, in the low careful voice men use when the news is not good, of debts. Not debts that were shameful, he said. Not debts that could not be borne. But debts that would, if they were not addressed within the year, require the sale of Wexley Hall itself, and the retreat of the family to some smaller house in some smaller town, where they would live on what remained of a modest annuity, and Marianne, who had refused 3 suitors on aesthetic grounds and 1 on temperamental grounds, would perhaps have cause to reconsider whether she had refused too many. It had been said quietly. It had been said only once. But once had been enough, and the debt, in the way of debts, had begun to knock at the tall doors of the drawing-room, and to walk the corridors, and to sit down in the empty chair opposite Clara's own, and to look at her patiently and to wait. Clara felt nothing about the debt directly. She was not the elder daughter. She was not the beauty. She had not been raised to think of her marriage as the family's salvation. And yet she felt something all the same, a small pressing thing under the ribs, the way a person feels something when they see a fire in a distant field and know that the wind is moving in the direction of the house. It was not her fire, but she lived in the house. She turned the page of her book without having read the previous one, and she heard, from below stairs, the sound she had been half listening for and half dreading, which was the sound of hooves and wheels on the wet gravel of the drive. Someone had arrived. Her mother's voice rose faintly, sharp with the particular pitch it took on when a visitor of consequence was expected, and Clara, without haste and without reluctance, closed the book, set it on the small round table beside her chair, and stood. She was wearing her plainest gray day dress. She had not chosen it that morning because she had known there would be a visitor. She had chosen it because it was Tuesday, and on Tuesdays she wore gray, and she had been wearing gray on Tuesdays for as long as she could remember, and she had not thought about it once. She smoothed the folds of the skirt with one hand, glanced at the spider in the window frame, thought, without particular sentiment, that she hoped no one would sweep it away too quickly, and went down. The nobleman had been announced as Lord Edmund Ashcombe. He was, Clara understood from the low, urgent narration her mother offered on the landing, the second son of the Earl of Marchfield, a man of substantial independent fortune from his mother's side, unmarried, of 35, and possessed of a manner that all the mothers of Northampton and its surrounding counties had agreed was flawless. He had been staying, this past week, with the Ferrars at Brookmere, and the Ferrars had, at Clara's mother's request and by the operations of a network of visiting cards and half-worded invitations that Clara only dimly understood, contrived to send Lord Edmund on toward Wexley Hall, ostensibly to view the library, which was locally reputed for its collection of first-edition natural histories, and actually, of course, to view Marianne. Marianne had spent the morning at her toilette. Her hair had been dressed twice. She was wearing a gown of the color that flatterers, when speaking of it, called cornflower, and that Clara, who liked plainer names, called simply blue. Suited her. Everything suited her. Lord Edmund was, as advertised, handsome. He was tall, well-made, with a face of the arrangement that painters call classical and mothers call fortunate. His hair a dark chestnut brown. His eyes a pale hazel. His bearing precisely what a man of his position had been trained from boyhood to display, which was to say, at ease with rooms that admired him and confident that they would. He had brought with him a companion, a quieter man of perhaps 28, plainly dressed in the dark, sober coat of an upper servant, whose function seemed to be the discreet management of Lord Edmund's affairs on this visit. His letters, his horses, his engagements. The companion was introduced only briefly, and not by any full name, only as Mr. Thorne, Lord Edmund's man of business on this small journey, and Clara barely looked at him, because at the moment of introduction she was watching, without meaning to watch, the way Marian offered her hand to Lord Edmund and the way Lord Edmund took it, and she thought, with a small sudden clarity that surprised her, that Marianne was performing, and that Lord Edmund was performing, and that the whole exchange was a piece of theatre in which everyone knew their lines and no one, exactly, believed them. 200 miles away, in a great house in London whose master was said to be travelling in the north, a housekeeper was folding linens into a chest and thinking that her master had been gone longer than she had expected, and she was not, she reminded herself, permitted to speculate on the reason. 200 miles away, that housekeeper was thinking of him. 15 feet away from Clara, in the drawing-room of Wexley Hall, that same man stood in a servant's coat, quietly setting Lord Edmund's driving gloves on a side table, and Clara did not see him at all. It was only in the smaller drawing-room, when the party was assembled for tea and Lord Edmund was placed, by her mother's arrangement, on the settee beside Marianne, and Clara was placed, by her own choice, in the shadow of the alcove by the window, that Clara noticed Mr. Thorne again, because Mr. Thorne had chosen, when the tea things were brought in, to help. This was in itself unusual. A gentleman's man of business, on a formal visit to a country house, did not typically help with the tea. He waited outside or in the servants' hall, or, if kept near his master, stood by the wall in the discreet posture of a person who is present but not participating. But Mr. Thorne, when the maid stumbled slightly on the edge of the rug and the tray tipped and a cup began to slide, moved without any hesitation and caught the cup, and set it right, and murmured something to the maid so quietly that Clara could not hear the words, only the tone, and the maid, who was young and had been near tears with the shame of the near accident, took a small breath and smiled at him and went on. Clara had watched the whole thing from the alcove without meaning to, and she had thought, in the private quiet of her own head, that a man who catches a cup before it falls and speaks gently to the maid who was about to drop it is a man worth noting. And she had noted him, and she had gone on watching, and she had missed, entirely, the compliment that Lord Edmund was at that moment paying to Marianne's gown. The visit was to last a fortnight. That had been decided, over the tea things, in a series of small agreements that were expressed as questions and understood as decisions. Lord Edmund would be Wexley Hall's guest. He would view the library. He would ride the estate. He would be present at the small country ball that the Ferrers were giving at the end of the fortnight, at which Marianne would be, by every implicit understanding, the guest of honor, or as near to it as Clara's family could arrange. He had brought only Mr. Thorne with him, no valet, no groom, no underservant, and Clara's mother, who was already recalculating the household's provisions for the fortnight, was quietly pleased. A man who traveled with only one attendant was a man of practical habits, and practical habits, in a suitor of Marianne's, were to be encouraged. It did not occur to Clara's mother, and it did not, at first, occur to Clara, that a man might travel with only one attendant for reasons other than practicality. It did not occur to Clara's mother or to Clara that Mr. Thorne, in his plain dark coat and his quiet catching of teacups, might be traveling in that particular arrangement for a reason of his own. That night, Clara could not sleep, which was unusual for her, and she rose in her nightdress and her wrapper and went, barefoot, to the small library at the end of the east corridor, because she had a habit, when sleep would not come, of finding a book and reading it standing by the window until the words in front of her eyes and the darkness at her back agreed with each other, and she was allowed to go back to bed. She did not expect to find anyone in the library at that hour. She found Mr. Thorne. He was standing at the far shelf, a candle in one hand, a book open in the other, and he was reading. He had not heard her come in because he was standing with his back partly toward the door, and because he was, she saw at once, entirely absorbed in what he was reading. She stopped in the doorway. She thought about turning back. She did not turn back. She said quietly, so as not to startle him, "I did not mean to disturb you." He turned. He was not startled. He said, "You have not disturbed me. It is your house." His voice was low, and he had, she noticed, an accent that was not quite the West Country accent that men in his supposed station generally had. It was the accent of a man who had been educated somewhere with tall windows and long corridors, and who had, at some point, taken care to soften the tallness and the length of those corridors out of his speech. Clara did not remark on it. She said, "What are you reading?" He turned the book gently so that she could see the spine, and she saw that it was a volume of natural history, one of the first editions her father had once been so proud of, and specifically it was a volume on the songbirds of the English hedgerow, and Clara, without meaning to, smiled, because it had been her favorite as a girl, and she had not seen it opened by anyone else in years. She said, "That one has a mistake in it on page 94. The illustrator has drawn the yellow hammer with the markings of the corn bunting." Mr. Thorne looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to page 94 and studied the illustration, and then he laughed once, a quiet surprise sound, and he said, "So he has. I would never have noticed. I do not know one songbird from another. I am ashamed of it." Clara said, "You are not ashamed of it. If you were, you would not have said so." He looked at her again, and she thought, though she could not have said why she thought it, that no one had spoken to him that way in a long time, and she thought, further, that he did not mind. She stayed longer in the library than she had meant to. She did not know how the conversation began or how it turned or how, half an hour later, she was seated in the wing chair by the cold hearth with the book of songbirds on her lap, and Mr. Thorne was standing at the mantel with his candle at his elbow, and they were speaking not of songbirds but of loneliness, in the abstract, in the way that two strangers sometimes speak of the shape of a thing without touching the thing itself. He said at one point that he had spent much of the last year traveling on his master's business, and that he had grown tired, in a way he had not expected to grow tired, of being introduced as someone's man of business, and of standing at the edge of rooms and of watching other people be seen. He said it lightly. He said it as if it were a joke about himself. But Clara heard, under the lightness, something that was not a joke, and she said, without thinking, "I know that feeling. I have stood at the edge of my own rooms all my life." He looked at her then in a way that she would remember later, though at the time she only recorded it and moved on, and he said, "Have you?" And she said, "Yes." And they were both quiet for a little while, and then he said he ought to let her sleep, and she said she ought to let him read. And neither of them moved for another quarter of an hour, and when they at last did move and she carried her candle back to her own room, she felt, for reasons she could not have named, less alone than she had felt when she came down. She did not tell anyone in the morning that she had spoken to Mr. Thorne in the library at night. It did not occur to her to tell anyone. It was not the kind of thing one told. Marianne at breakfast was radiant in the professional way Marianne was radiant, and Lord Edmund was attentive, in the professional way Lord Edmund was attentive, and their mother was calibrating each glance and each half-turn of the head as if she were reading tea leaves. Their father, thinner than he had been in the spring, was silent at the head of the table, and once, when Clara looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not read, and he looked away quickly and drank his tea. Mr. Thorne was not at breakfast. Servants, even servants of Mr. Thorne's ambiguous rank, did not breakfast in the family dining room. Clara found herself, as the meal proceeded, listening for footsteps in the hall. The fortnight became a season. That was how it felt, though only 14 days would pass. Lord Edmund rode with Marianne in the mornings, when the weather permitted, and read to her in the afternoons, when it did not, and paid her the sort of compliments that gentlemen in Lord Edmund's position had been paying young women in Marianne's position for 100 years, and Marianne received them with the sort of grace that young women in Marianne's position had been trained to receive them with, and everyone in the house, from her mother to the parlour-maid, understood that within the fortnight Lord Edmund would speak to Clara's father, and Marianne would say yes, and the debt at the doors of the drawing-room would be sent, at last, away. It was a script that everyone was reading. Everyone but Marianne, whose eyes, Clara noticed on the third day, followed Lord Edmund out of every room with a small measuring calm, and did not soften when he was gone. Clara, meanwhile, went on with her days. She saw to the linens. She spoke to the housekeeper. She read to her father in the afternoons when he was too weak to read himself. And she found in the evenings that she went, without deciding to the small library at the end of the east corridor, and that Mr. Thorne was there, and that he was reading, and that when she came in, he set the book aside and they spoke. They spoke of the songbirds of the hedgerow, and of the light on the oaks along the drive, and once of a small crippled dog that had come to the kitchen door that afternoon, and that Clara had ordered fed. He had asked her, quite seriously, why she had ordered the dog fed, and she had said, more seriously than she meant to, that she had ordered the dog fed because she believed one could tell a great deal about a household by what came to its kitchen door and whether it went away hungry. He had looked at her a long moment, and he had said quietly, "That will stick with me." And she had thought no more of it at the time. She was not, in any conscious way, falling in love. She was 23. She had watched Marianne be courted, in one form or another, since Marianne was 17. She knew the language of falling in love, or thought she did, and she did not use it about herself, and she did not use it about Mr. Thorne. She thought of what was happening in the library, if she thought of it at all, as friendship. She had not had a friend before. She had had a sister, and she had had her father, and she had had the servants of the house who were kind to her but were not, and could not be, her equals. She had never had a person who spoke to her about songbirds or crippled dogs, or the shape of loneliness in the abstract, without any reference to whether she was pretty, or whether she was accomplished, or whether she was likely to marry well. She had never had anyone, before Mr. Thorne, who spoke to her as if the fact of her existence were, in itself, a thing of interest. She did not call this love. She did not know that this was one of the things love could be. She was learning it, without knowing she was learning it, and she was learning it in a plain gray dress at 10 o'clock at night by the light of a single candle in a room that smelled faintly of leather and dust. Lord Edmund, meanwhile, was becoming aware of her. This was not, at first, obvious to Clara, because Lord Edmund's attention was so entirely fixed on Marianne, and Clara's assumptions about her own place in the room were so entirely settled, that it took her a full week to notice that Lord Edmund had begun to look at her when he thought she would not see. He looked at her at dinner, when Marianne was speaking. He looked at her in the drawing-room, when Marianne was at the pianoforte. He looked at her, once, in the garden, when she had bent to lift a fallen glove of her father's from the gravel of the path, and had straightened without knowing he was there. She had not returned the looks. She had not, when she noticed them, particularly liked them. Lord Edmund was handsome and courteous, and possessed of every accomplishment a young woman of Marianne's position was supposed to want. And Clara could see all of that perfectly well, and it did not move her. She thought, in the private way she thought things, that Lord Edmund's looks at her were the looks of a man who has been offered a very fine dish at dinner and, having eaten his fill of it, has begun to consider whether the plainer dish on the sideboard might, in the end, offer a more restful meal. This was not, Clara thought, a compliment. It was the opposite of a compliment. It was the observation of a man who was accustomed to being able to choose. On the 12th day of the fortnight, in the small drawing-room, in a moment that Clara had not anticipated and that her mother had entirely orchestrated, Lord Edmund asked to speak with Clara alone. Marianne had been sent, on some pretext, to the greenhouse. Their mother had withdrawn, tactfully, to the morning room. Their father was upstairs. The rain had begun again outside, and the tall windows were beaded with it. Lord Edmund was standing at the mantel. He was, Clara noticed, taller in the light of the mantel than he was in the light of the drawing-room ordinarily, and it occurred to her that he had chosen the position deliberately. He said, without preamble, that he had made a mistake. He said it very handsomely. He said that when he had come to Wexley Hall, he had come with certain expectations, formed at a distance, of what he would find there, and that he had found something else, and that he wished to be honest about it. He said that Miss Marian Whitmore was an accomplished and beautiful young woman, and that she deserved a husband who valued her as she deserved to be valued, and that he, upon reflection, was not that man. He said that he had come to admire, in his fortnight at Wexley Hall, a different quality altogether, a quality of quiet, of steadiness, of a kind of grace that did not require the room to look at it, and that this quality, he had come to feel, was more precious to him than any of the accomplishments the country generally admired. He said that he had come to believe, in short, that he had, by an accident of introduction, applied himself to the wrong sister, and that he wished, with her permission, to correct it. He asked her, in language that was very correctly framed and very carefully rehearsed, whether she would consider him. Clara stood still. She did not immediately answer. She was aware, in the still moment before she spoke, of several things at once. She was aware of the shape of the debt at the door. She was aware of her father's face at breakfast that morning. She was aware of Marianne in the greenhouse, being kept out of the way. She was aware of the fact that her mother would consider this proposal, on the merits, the salvation of the family, and that any reasonable young woman in her situation would accept it, would in fact fall down and kiss the hem of the coat of the man who had offered it. She was also aware, though this awareness was quieter and stranger and did not yet have a name, of a certain small candle at the mantel of a certain small library on the east corridor, and of a hand that had caught a cup, and of a voice that had said, "That will stick with me." She looked at Lord Edmund. She saw, in his face, only the calm assumption of a man who had never been refused. She saw that he expected her, in this moment, to weep, or to blush, or to falter, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she owed him honesty, at least in exchange for the honesty of his address. So she said, and she said it very quietly and very plainly, and without cruelty of any kind, "I am grateful to you, Lord Edmund, for the honor of your regard. But I cannot marry you." He blinked. He had not expected this. He said, in a tone that was trying to remain courteous and was slipping, at the edges, into astonishment, "May I ask why?" And Clara said, still quietly, "Because I do not love you, and I do not think you love me. I think you have observed me at close quarters for 2 weeks, and you have decided that I am restful, and I do not think that is the same thing." Lord Edmund said nothing for a moment. He seemed briefly less handsome than he had been. He said, "At length you understand what you are refusing." And Clara said, "I do." He said, "Your family's circumstances," and Clara said, "Yes. I know my family's circumstances. I know them better than you do." He said more quietly, "Is there another?" And Clara paused, because the honest answer to that question was, she found, complicated in a way she had not realized until it was asked. She said, "At last, there is no other engagement. There is no other understanding." But there is, in me, a preference. And I would not marry you when I have a preference elsewhere. It would not be fair to you. Lord Edmund looked at her for a long moment. He was, she saw, being asked to be a gentleman under conditions that he had not prepared for, and he was, to his credit, being one. He bowed. He said, "I wish you well, Miss Whitmore. I regret very much that I asked at the wrong moment. I hope, in time, we may still be friends." And Clara, who did not quite know what to say to that, said, "I hope so too." And Lord Edmund left the room. 10 minutes later, in the garden, in the rain, without a wrapper, without a bonnet, and without any account for what she was doing, Clara found Mr. Thorne. He was standing under the great yew at the corner of the wall, watching the drive. He did not look surprised to see her. He said quietly, "You are getting wet." And she said, "Yes." And he took off his coat and set it around her shoulders, and she felt the warmth of it, and she smelled, faintly on the collar, the smell of pipe tobacco and of some soap that was not the soap her family used, and she said, before she could stop herself, "I refused him." Mr. Thorne was silent for a long moment. He said, "At last, did you?" And she said, "Yes." And she looked up at him. She looked up at him, and she saw in his face an expression she could not name, and she said, "Mr. Thorne, I do not know very much about you. I do not know where you were educated. I do not know what your family is. I do not know why you travel with only your coat and one horse and no address. But I have come to know you, this fortnight, better than I have known anyone in a very long time, and if you were to ask me a question at this moment, I would answer it." Mr. Thorne did not ask her a question. He was silent for a very long moment, and then he said, in a voice that was different from the voice he had used in the library, a voice that was quieter and, in some way, older, "Miss Whitmore, there is a thing I must tell you. I have not been honest about myself, and I cannot ask you any question until I have been." She waited. He said, "At last, my name is not Thorne. My name is Alistair Vane. I am the 11th Duke of Ravensmere. I came to Wexley Hall in the party of my cousin, Lord Edmund Ashcombe, because Lord Edmund is a good man and a valuable ally, and because I wished to see, without being seen, how a house that had been recommended to me conducted itself. I have spent the last year finding it difficult to know, at any distance, whether the persons I am introduced to are addressing me or the estate behind my name. I devised, foolishly, this small deception. I did not know when I devised it that I would find, in the library of Wexley Hall at 10 o'clock at night, a young woman who spoke to me about songbirds and did not know I was a duke, and did not care. I have imposed on your household. I have taken your friendship under a false name. I owe you an apology, and I offer it. I do not offer you any question, because I have not earned any question. But I could not let you refuse a proposal in the garden without knowing, at least, who was standing beside you when you refused it." Clara stood very still in the rain. She was cold, and she was warmer than she had been in months. She said, "At length, Alistair Vane." He said, "Yes." She said, "Duke of Ravensmere." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you have been sleeping in the small east bedroom, and helping the maids with the tea, and reading first edition natural histories in the library at 10 o'clock at night." He said, "I have been sleeping in the small east bedroom, and I helped the maid once with a teacup, and I have been reading the natural history because it is very fine and I am ashamed I have never read it before." Clara looked at him. She said, "Your Grace." He winced. She said, "I do not know what to call you." He said, "Alistair." She said, "That is not proper." He said, "No, it is not. I have not, tonight, been proper." She was quiet a long moment. She said, "You said you would not ask a question. But if you did ask one, I said I would answer it." He looked at her a long moment. He said, "Miss Whitmore, Clara, I have known you a fortnight. I have known myself in your company. In a way I have not known myself in a very long time. I have no right to ask what I am about to ask. If you tell me to go, I will go, and I will not trouble you further, and I will remember the songbirds. But I cannot leave this garden without asking. Will you consider, in time, a proposal from me made honestly in my own name with all its inconvenient weight?" And Clara Whitmore, who had refused a handsome nobleman in the drawing-room 10 minutes earlier because she had, in her own accounting, a preference elsewhere, said quietly, standing under a yew tree in a borrowed coat in the rain, "Yes, I will consider it. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. He did not ask her to answer at once. He did not press her. He said only that he would go that night to speak with Lord Edmund, and that he would go in the morning to speak with her father, and that after that he would leave Wexley Hall for a week and return, and that in that week she was to decide, in the quiet of her own house, whether the offer he intended to make was one she wished to accept. He said this very calmly, and she understood, hearing him, that he was giving her the one thing that no proposal she had ever heard of had given a young woman. He was giving her the room to change her mind. He turned to leave the garden. He paused. He said, "One thing, Miss Whitmore. I would not have asked. If you had not spoken to me first, I would have taken my coat and my horse and I would have gone from this house and you would never have known me. I want you to understand that. The choice, from the beginning, has been yours." And he left, and Clara stood a moment longer under the yew, and then she took his coat from her shoulders and folded it over her arm, and she walked back to the house. The week that followed was, in the private accounting of Wexley Hall, an earthquake. Lord Edmund, informed that night by his cousin, behaved with more grace than any of the ladies of Wexley Hall had reason to expect from him, and departed the following morning with warm expressions of continuing friendship, and with, Clara suspected, a certain quiet relief at having been released from a courtship that had begun to feel like a duty. Mr. Thorne, Alastair, the Duke of Ravensmere, though he was still, in Clara's private thought, Mr. Thorne for another day at least, spoke with her father in the small study, and Clara did not know what was said, and Clara's father, when he came out of the study, was pale and quiet, and he called Clara to him, and he looked at her a long time, and he said, "Is this what you want, my dear?" And Clara said, "Yes, papa." And her father said, "You are certain?" And Clara said, "I am certain." And her father, who had not touched her cheek in 10 years, touched her cheek. And Clara's mother, informed within the hour, sat down hard on the settee in the small drawing-room and said nothing for a full quarter of an hour, and when she at last spoke, she said only, "The Duke of Ravensmere," in a tone that could have been horror or wonder or both, and then she said, "Marianne must be told with care." And Marianne, when she was told, in the greenhouse where she had been kept out of the way for so many pretenses, laughed. Not cruelly, not bitterly, but with a real quick surprised delight that startled Clara, and said, "Oh, Clara, oh, finally, oh, good," and she embraced her sister, and Clara understood, in that embrace, that Marianne had been paying more attention than anyone knew, and that Marianne had not, in fact, wanted Lord Edmund, and that Marianne had never wanted any of them. Alastair left Wexley Hall on the morning after his interview with Clara's father, as he had said he would, and Clara had a week in her own house to consider his offer. She considered it. She walked the drive under the oaks. She sat in the small library at 10 o'clock at night, alone with a candle. She thought of the crippled dog at the kitchen door. She thought of the yellowhammer on page 94. She thought of the accent that had been softened out of his speech, and the way he had caught a cup, and the way he had said, in the garden, that he had spent a year at the edges of rooms, and she thought, with a certain slow clarity, that she had spent all her life at the edges of rooms, and that the only person she had ever met who had understood what that was, without her having to explain it, was a man in a plain dark coat who had turned out to be a duke, and that this was, in its own way, a joke, and that she was going to marry him. At the end of the week, when he returned to Wexley Hall, she met him in the drawing-room in her plainest grey day dress, because it was a Tuesday, and she said, without any preamble, yes. And he said, "Thank you." And that was the whole of their engagement. The wedding was, at Clara's insistence and Alastair's easy agreement, small. It took place 3 weeks later in the parish church of Wexley Village, on a bright cold morning in early November, with only the household and a handful of neighbors present. Marianne stood as witness. Clara's father, walking her down the short aisle, cried once, silently, and then straightened his shoulders and gave her hand to the Duke of Ravensmere with a formality that surprised even himself. Alastair wore a plain dark coat, not because he was pretending to be Mr. Thorne any longer, but because it suited him, and because it suited her, and because they had decided, without discussion, that they would not begin their marriage in a costume. Clara wore a grey silk. It was not white. It was not fashionable. It was hers. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alastair took her hand and did not let it go, Clara Whitmore, who had spent 23 years standing at the edges of rooms, found that she had, without noticing exactly when it happened, walked to the center of one. They travelled the next day to Ravensmere. Ravensmere was a very great house. Clara had not entirely understood how great a house it was until she saw it. It stood on a rise of ground in Buckinghamshire, 4 hours' drive from London, with an approach of nearly a mile through parkland and a lake in front of the south facade and a west wing so long that Clara, seeing it for the first time from the carriage window, had to look twice to be sure she was seeing all of it. She said nothing about the size of the house. Alistair did not offer any speech about it. He handed her down from the carriage in the courtyard, and the whole staff of the house was assembled at the door, and Clara was introduced to them one by one, and she remembered every name because she had been trained since girlhood to remember names, and because it seemed to her important. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Hollis of perhaps 50 years, met her eye with a small careful curiosity, and Clara understood at once that Mrs. Hollis had been running Ravensmere without a mistress for a long time, and that she was watching to see what sort of mistress she now had, and Clara resolved, in that first minute, that she would not disturb Mrs. Hollis's arrangements without cause, and that she would ask questions before she made changes, and that whatever else she was going to be at Ravensmere, she was not going to be a fool. The first weeks of her marriage were formal. This was to be expected. Alistair had estate business that had been neglected during his fortnight in Northamptonshire, and further business that had been neglected in the week he had returned to Wexley Hall, and business generally that a duke of his standing was expected to attend to, and he was, for the first fortnight of her residence at Ravensmere, absent for large parts of every day, and often not present at dinner, and once absent for 3 days entirely on a journey to a distant tenant farm whose barn had burned. In a lightning storm, Clara did not mind exactly. She had not married Alistair because she wished to be entertained by him. But she noticed, and she was honest with herself about the noticing, that the house at Ravensmere was very large and very quiet, and that the corridors that led from her rooms to the small breakfast parlor were long, and that the mirrors along those corridors were tall, and that she saw herself, going from one room to another, more often than she had ever seen herself in her life, and that the version of herself she saw in those mirrors was a small figure in a gray dress in a house of very high ceilings, and that this small figure looked, some days, as if she did not entirely know why she was there. She had, in those first weeks, a small private ritual that she told no one about, because to have told anyone about it would have been to make it something other than what it was. Every morning, before she rang for her maid, she rose and stood at the tall east-facing window of her dressing room, and she looked out at the parkland, and she counted, one at a time and without hurry, the mature oaks along the mile of the drive. There were 42. On the first morning, she had counted them because she wished to be sure she had understood the scale of the property. On the second, because she wished to see if she had counted correctly. On the third, because she had begun to like the counting. And after that, because it had become the small deliberate act by which she reminded herself each morning that she was a woman who could count the trees on her own drive, and that this fact was not, in itself, either grand or dreadful, but only true. Alistair did not know about the counting. Louisa did not know. Mrs. Hollis, who knew almost everything, did not know. It was hers. She developed, in that same period, a second habit of walking the same length of the same corridor twice each afternoon, once in the direction of the small breakfast parlor, once in the direction of the small library at the end of the east wing. She did it because the corridor was long and because she wished, without discussing it with anyone, to learn its length in her own footsteps. She counted those too, but she did not tell herself the number. She only knew that on the first afternoon the walk had felt long, and on the second slightly less long, and by the end of the second week the walk had ceased to feel long at all, and that this, more than any of the introductions Mrs. Hollis had performed in the courtyard on her first day, was the measure by which she was becoming, in a real and small and unshowy way, the mistress of the house. She did not congratulate herself on this. She only noticed it. And once, standing at a window at the end of the corridor and looking out at the winter parkland in the failing afternoon light, she thought, with a small still clarity, that she had lived 23 years in a house she had known perfectly and had never once, in all those years, felt that the house was hers. Ravensmere, which was not perfectly known to her, and which was 10 times the size of Wexley Hall, was becoming hers now, one corridor at a time, in a way she could not have explained to anyone. Louisa was one of the mirrors. Louisa Vane, Alistair's younger sister, was 23 as Clara herself was 23, and she had lived at Ravensmere all her life, and she had, until the previous month, been the only woman of standing in the house, and she was not, at first, sure that she wished to share it. Louisa was tall, dark, quick-tongued, quick-witted and quick-humored, and she was, Clara understood within their first hour of acquaintance, a person who had been ill-treated at some point in her life and had never quite forgiven it, and who used her sharpness the way another person might use a good coat, as a thing to be worn against the weather. Louisa did not dislike Clara, and Louisa did not like Clara, and Louisa was watching, in the way Mrs. Hollis was watching, and Clara understood that too, and Clara set herself, quietly, to be patient. Louisa felt nothing. It was a lie. Louisa felt, on the day Clara arrived at Ravensmere, precisely the same thing Clara felt on the day Lord Edmund Ashcombe had arrived at Wexley Hall. The arrival of a stranger into a house that had been, for the whole of one's life, one's own. Clara knew that feeling. Clara did not say she knew it. She waited. The isolation of the first month was broken, without any speech about it, by a small change to the dining room. On the 5th day of the second week, when Alastair had returned from the distant tenant's barn and had washed and dressed for dinner, and when Clara had come down to the great dining room and had taken her place at the very far end of the very long table, where a place had been laid for her opposite Alastair's place, she found, waiting for her, not the long formal table she had been eating at every night, but a small round table set up near the fire in the smaller room adjacent, with 2 places, and 2 chairs and 1 candle, and Alastair, who was standing beside it in his dark coat with his hands behind his back, looking, for the first time since their wedding, uncertain. He said, when she came in, I have been thinking. The great table is very great. It seems to me that a great table is a very inconvenient thing between 2 people who wish to speak to each other. I asked Mrs. Hollis to have this brought down. If you would rather have the great table, we will have the great table. Clara looked at the small round table. She looked at the fire. She looked at Alastair. She said, quite steadily, I would rather have this. And they sat down at the small round table by the fire, and Mrs. Hollis, who had been standing at the door, exchanged one very quick look with Clara that Clara did not entirely understand at the time but understood later, and Mrs. Hollis went out, and the door closed, and Alastair reached across the small round table and took Clara's hand, for the first time since the church, and he said, I have not been a very good husband this fortnight. I am going to try to be better. And Clara, who was not entirely sure how one answered such a speech, said, You have been busy. I did not marry you to sit in your pocket. But I have missed you. And Alastair looked at her a long moment, and he said, Have you? And she said, Yes. And the small round table from that night forward stayed. It was such a small change. It was a table of perhaps 3 feet across, of plain unornamented oak, with 4 turned legs and no inlay, that had, Mrs. Hollis privately confided to Clara some weeks later, been used in the days of Alastair's grandmother as a card table in the smaller drawing room and had been retired to a storeroom for nearly 40 years. It was, by any measurement of value that Ravensmere would ordinarily have applied to its furniture, worthless, an object no visitor of consequence would ever have been permitted to see. But it was, in the private accounting of the house from that night forward, the most important piece of furniture in it. It sat in the smaller adjoining dining room near the fire, laid every evening for 2, and it was at that table, and not at the great state table in the state dining room, that the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere took their supper for the rest of the winter. Mrs. Hollis, without being asked, arranged the flowers on it herself each morning. 1 small stem of whatever the greenhouse could spare. Never a great arrangement, only a single flower quietly placed. The under-servants noticed. The under-servants noticed everything. And by the end of that first week of the small round table, there was, in the ordinary talk of the servants' hall, a small warm thing that had not been there before, which was the sense that the master and the new mistress were becoming a pair, and that the pair had chosen, of its own accord and without any pressure from anyone, to sit close. Clara did not, at that time or later, describe to anyone what she felt about the small round table. She had, all her life, been suspicious of the vocabulary of feeling, because that vocabulary had, in her experience, been used most often by people who were performing an emotion they did not actually possess. But she noticed, without needing words for it, that when she sat down to the small round table each evening and looked across it at Alastair, and Alastair looked back at her, and their knees were, by the geometry of the thing, only inches apart under the plain oak surface, she felt, for the first time in her life, entirely present in the room she was in. She was not calculating what her mother would want her to say next. She was not measuring her sister's beauty against her own. She was not watching the door for a visitor she had not been permitted to expect. She was simply at supper with a man who was her husband, who was also, in the way that only a small number of very fortunate people ever discover, her friend. The soup was hot. The fire was warm. The candle was steady. And she understood, more clearly than she had ever understood anything about herself, that she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for a room in which she could be present, and that this was that room. It was after the small round table came into the dining room that the house at Ravensmere began, in small and various ways, to change. Not because Clara imposed changes on it. She did not. She had resolved not to. But because Alistair, once he had begun to be present with her, began to be present in other places, and because a duke's presence in a house is a thing the whole house feels, and because Clara, in her quiet way, began to be seen. She spoke to Mrs. Hollis about the linen presses. She spoke to the head gardener about the winter roses. She spoke to the steward about the tenant whose barn had burned, and she asked, quietly, whether the tenant's wife had needs that the estate had not yet supplied, and the steward, startled, said he would find out and report to her, and he did, and Clara arranged for 2 blankets and a store of oats and a promise of assistance with the spring planting to be sent to the tenant's wife, and it was noted, though not by Clara, that no previous mistress of Ravensmere had ever asked after a tenant's wife by name. Louisa noted it. Louisa noted many things. Louisa, in that second month, began to seek Clara out in small unnecessary ways, on the pretext of asking her opinion of a piece of music or a book or a shawl, and Clara understood, without any speech about it, that Louisa was making an approach, and Clara made herself easy to approach. On a wet afternoon in early December, when the rain was against the windows and the fire was high and Alistair was in the estate office with the steward, Louisa came into Clara's small sitting room and sat down in the chair by the fire and was silent a long time, and then Louisa said, without preamble, "You have not asked me why I am the way I am." And Clara, who had not looked up from her needlework, said, "No, I have not asked. I did not think you owed me an answer." And Louisa laughed once, sharply, and she said, "Well, that, at least, is refreshing." And she told Clara, in a great sudden rush of speech, that she had been engaged, 3 years earlier, to a man of good family and moderate fortune, and that a woman of her acquaintance, a woman who had wanted the same man, had, by a series of forged letters and carefully placed rumors, contrived to break the engagement, and that the man had married the other woman, and that Louisa had spent 3 years in that house and in the neighboring houses being spoken of as the young lady who had been jilted, and that she had come to hate the neighboring houses, and to hate the season, and to hate, above all, the woman who had done it, whose name was Lady Ophelia Ashcombe, and who was, Louisa said with a small hard smile, the sister of Lord Edmund Ashcombe. Clara set down her needlework. She said, "Lord Edmund's sister." Louisa said, "Yes." Clara said, "The woman who," Louisa said, "Yes." Clara said, "And she is," Louisa said, "She is in London. She will be at the Ravensmere ball in the spring. She will not have missed the news of your marriage. She will come to see it. She hates me, and she does not know you, and she will decide, on the drive from London, that she hates you as well, because she cannot bear that a house that was ours is ours." And Clara sat quietly a long moment. And then she said, "Thank you for telling me." And Louisa, whose eyes were bright but not wet, said, "You are welcome." And they sat together by the fire, and neither of them said anything else, and after a while Louisa took up Clara's other needle and began, without permission and without comment, to help. There was, at Ravensmere, an elderly aunt of Alistair's on his mother's side, a Lady Cordelia Vane, who had lived in the dower house on the edge of the park for as long as anyone could remember, and who was fond of Alistair and had been fond of Alistair's mother and had a habit, in the winters, of driving up in her old carriage on Wednesday afternoons to take tea in the small blue drawing-room and to say whatever came into her head. Clara had met her only twice in the first month of her marriage, but Lady Cordelia, on the 3rd Wednesday of the 2nd month, sent word that she wished to take tea with the Duchess alone, and Clara went to the small blue drawing-room at 3 o'clock and found Lady Cordelia sitting in the high-backed chair by the window with her stick across her knees and her sharp small eyes watching the door. Lady Cordelia was 74 years old, and thin and upright, and possessed of a manner that made it very clear she had watched a great many young women marry into a great many great houses and had formed opinions about most of them. She said, when Clara had sat down, "You are quiet." Clara said, "I am." Lady Cordelia said, Are you quiet because you are frightened? Or are you quiet because you have nothing to prove? Clara considered this. She said, I hope it is the second. It may be a little of the first as well. Lady Cordelia laughed. She said, that is an honest answer. I am not accustomed to honest answers.
Sit closer.
Pour the tea. And Clara sat closer and poured the tea, and Lady Cordelia said, now, I have watched 3 young women marry into this house in my time. 2 of them tried to change the house. The house did not change. The 3rd accepted the house and let the house change her, and she died at 40 of no particular ailment. Do not do either of those things. And Clara said, what shall I do then? And Lady Cordelia looked at her a long moment, and she said, change the house without letting the house know you are doing it. Move the small tables. Change the flowers. Ask the housekeeper what she thinks. Never speak of London if you can help it. And when Ophelia Ashcombe comes for the spring ball, and she will come, you will look her in the eye and you will not blink. That is all. And Clara said, yes, Lady Cordelia. And Lady Cordelia said, Aunt Cordelia, if you please. And Clara, who had not been called anyone's niece in her life, felt, for a moment, a warmth in her throat that she had to swallow before she could speak. And she said, yes, Aunt Cordelia. And Aunt Cordelia drank her tea, and set the cup down and said, good, that is settled. Now, tell me about the songbirds. The winter closed in. Alistair was present now. Alistair was present at breakfast and at dinner at the small round table, and in the small library after supper where Clara had, without speech, moved a second wing chair to face the first, and Alistair had, without speech, accepted the arrangement. They read together. They spoke together. On one very cold night, when the wind was against the west wing and the fire in the small library was high, Alistair set down his book and said, I have never told anyone about my brother. Clara had known, from the servants and from Louisa and from the letters of condolence that still, occasionally, came to the house, that Alistair had had an elder brother, and that the brother had died at Waterloo, and that Alistair had not expected to inherit, and had done so at 22, and had spent the 10 years since being trained by his father and then, upon his father's death 6 years past, being on his own. She had never asked Alistair about it. She had not thought it was hers to ask. She said, would you like to tell me now? And Alistair said, I would like to tell you now. And he told her, over an hour and a candle and a low fire, about a brother who had been better than he was, quicker, warmer, more beloved, who had ridden out to a war his family had not wanted him to ride out to, and who had not come back, and about a father who had never quite forgiven the son who had come back, though he had not said so, and who had trained that son severely, and about a mother who had died 2 years before the father, and about the 10 quiet years since. He said, at the end, I did not know until the fortnight at Wexley Hall that I had been lonely for 10 years. I thought I had been busy. I discover I was mistaken. And Clara, who had been listening with her hand on the arm of her chair and her eyes on the fire, said quietly, I have been lonely for 23. And Alistair reached across the space between the 2 chairs, and took her hand, and did not speak, and did not let go, and the fire went low, and neither of them noticed. They fell, in that second month, into a set of small evening rituals that neither of them named. He would come into the small library at 9:15, having finished his correspondence in the estate office. She would already be there, in what had become her chair, with the book she had chosen from the shelves that day. He would set his candle on the sill. He would sit. Sometimes they read for an hour in near complete silence, broken only by the fire and the turning of a page. Sometimes he would look up from his book and ask her one small question about her day, whether Mrs. Hollis had spoken to her about the West Linen Room, whether the tenant's wife at Little Marsh had received the second parcel, and her answer would open into a longer conversation that neither of them had planned. Sometimes she would look up from her own book and ask him about the estate, about a name in a ledger she had not understood, about the peculiar system by which the tenants' quarter-day rents were reckoned against the improvements he had funded on their farms, and he would explain it to her at length and without condescension, and she would listen with the whole of her attention, and by the second month he had begun, without any speech about it, to describe estate matters to her as one describes them to a partner, not to a bystander. Neither of them announced this change. It was not the kind of change that required announcement. It only quietly happened in the space between two wing chairs, over the top of a small oak-side table, by the light of a single candle, night after night, until the accumulation of nights had, without anyone deciding it, become a marriage. The winter deepened. The house at Ravensmere, without any speech about it, was no longer only Alistair's house or Louisa's house or Mrs. Hollis's house. It was, in small ways and then in larger ways, becoming Clara's house as well, and Clara did not congratulate herself on this, because Clara did not congratulate herself on anything, but she noticed it. She noticed it when Mrs. Hollis, on a Tuesday morning, asked her, without being prompted, which of two menus she would prefer for the following week's dinner. She noticed it when the head gardener, without being sent for, appeared at the door of her sitting room to ask which of the winter roses she would like brought in for the drawing-room mantel. She noticed it when Louisa, without speech, took to sitting in Clara's small sitting room in the afternoons with her own needlework, and when Aunt Cordelia's Wednesday visits extended, without arrangement, from an hour to 2. She noticed it in smaller ways, too, that she did not itemize even to herself. In the way the young under-housemaid who had once flinched at being addressed by name now looked up and answered without flinching. In the way the head groom, when she came into the stable yard, no longer straightened as if he had been caught in some fault, but only nodded, as one working person to another, and went on with his bridle. In the way the cook, who had spent 30 years in the kitchens at Ravensmere and was known throughout the county for the ferocity of her opinions about pastry, had begun, without any speech about it, to send up on Wednesdays a small dish of the particular baked apples that Clara had once, in passing, mentioned she had liked as a girl. None of these were announcements. None of them were public. They were the small quiet transactions of a house that was, in the accumulation of small quiet weeks, coming to know its new mistress and coming, without deciding to trust her. Clara noticed each of them the way she noticed the changing light in the corridors. Not as achievements, only as facts. She had never, in her life before Ravensmere, been trusted by a room. She discovered that being trusted by a room was not something one earned by grand effort. It was something one earned by not attempting to earn it, by turning up on Tuesday in a gray dress and asking a housekeeper what she thought, and by doing this on Wednesday and again on Thursday, and by not, at any point, requiring anyone to notice that one had done it. She noticed it, most of all, when she walked the long corridor between her rooms and the small breakfast parlor and saw, in the tall mirrors, that the small figure in the gray dress was walking differently than she had walked in October. She was not walking faster. She was not walking with more show. She was walking as if she knew, at last, where the small breakfast parlor was, and as if the corridor was hers to walk. In February, the letters began to arrive from London. They arrived at the rate of 2 or 3 a week, and they were addressed to the Duchess of Ravensmere, and they were, in one form or another, invitations. Every hostess of any consequence in London had heard, by the beginning of the season, that the 11th Duke of Ravensmere had married unexpectedly and secretly in the autumn, that he had married a country girl of no particular fortune, that he was reputed to be devoted to her, and that he was, in the spring, expected to bring her to London. This was, for the hostesses of London, a matter of the very greatest interest. Clara, sitting at her small writing desk in her sitting room with a stack of letters in front of her, was not naive. She understood what the invitations meant. They meant that a great many people who had never spoken to her in their lives had decided, in advance, that they must speak to her, and that a great many of those people would arrive at their first meeting with her already convinced that they had formed a judgment. She understood that the season was going to be, in a way that the fortnight at Wexley Hall had not been, a public event, and that she was going to be, in a way she had not been at Wexley Hall, on display. She did not look forward to it. She did not, however, refuse it. She accepted 3 invitations, declined a great many others, and set aside one particular invitation, which was for the great ball at Ravensmere itself in early May, at which the whole of society was expected, and at which, Louisa had reminded her without cruelty on more than one occasion, Lady Ophelia Ashcombe would certainly appear. The rival was becoming visible. It was Louisa who kept Clara informed. Ophelia Ashcombe had, in the months since Clara's marriage, been active in London in ways that Louisa, through her old friends and her older acquaintances, was able to track. Ophelia had spoken of Clara at 3 dinners. Ophelia had made a joke about the plainness of Clara's dress at a Christmas ball in Grosvenor Square. Ophelia had, on one specific occasion, referred to Clara, within the hearing of at least 6 people, as the country nobody the Duke picked up out of pity. Louisa reported these things to Clara without embellishment, and Clara, hearing them, was surprised to find that she felt very little. She was not, she discovered, easily wounded by strangers. She had spent 23 years being unnoticed by strangers, and the pivot to being disliked by strangers did not seem to her, in itself, a great worsening. She said this to Louisa. Louisa laughed, but her eyes were serious. Louisa said, "Do not underestimate her, Clara. She will not stop at drawing-room jokes. She never has." And Clara said, "I know." And she did know. But she also knew, in the private accounting of her own head, that she had, over the winter, come into possession of something she had not had in October, and that this something, a husband who saw her, an aunt who called her niece, a house that was learning to be hers, was not the kind of possession that a drawing-room joke could take away. If Ophelia Ashcombe wished to attack her, Ophelia Ashcombe would have to attack the thing itself, and not merely her reflection in the mirrors. And Clara quietly made ready. She made ready first by learning her ground. She spent the late winter and the early spring reading the household ledgers with Mrs. Hollis, reading the estate accounts with the steward, reading the correspondence of her husband, with his permission and, more startlingly, at his request, until she understood, in a way she had not understood at the start, what the shape of Ravensmere was, and what the shape of Alastair's obligations in London was, and what allies he had and had not, and which of the great families in the coming season were friends and which were merely polite and which were, in more subtle ways, hostile. She learned that the Ashcombes, though allies of Ravensmere in name and in blood, Lord Edmund's mother had been for some years in a slow financial decline that Lord Edmund's father had not admitted to publicly, and that Ophelia Ashcombe's dowry, which had been publicly declared very large, was in fact largely borrowed against a house in Berkshire that the family did not wish to lose, and that Ophelia's search, for the last 2 seasons, had not been for love or even for status, but very specifically for a husband whose fortune could redeem the family's position. And Clara, reading this, sat very still for a long time at her writing desk and understood, with the small cold clarity that comes to people who have thought carefully about a difficulty, that Lady Ophelia Ashcombe hated her not because Clara was plain, and not because Clara was a country nobody, and not even because Clara had, however inadvertently, taken from Louisa a happiness that Ophelia had been prepared to take for herself. Ophelia hated Clara because Clara stood, in Ophelia's private accounting, for a possibility Ophelia had never had, to be loved for oneself. And that, Clara understood, was the kind of hatred that has nothing to do with the person it is aimed at, and everything to do with the person it is coming from. It was a hatred that would not be reasoned with. It would only be endured, and, in the endurance, outlasted. The Ashcombe letter arrived in April. It was addressed to Alastair. It was written in Lady Ophelia's small, exceedingly careful hand, and it requested, on behalf of the Ashcombe family, the honor of a private call at Ravensmere in advance of the spring ball, in order that the Ashcombes might pay their respects to the new Duchess, and it named a date and an hour and offered no other pretext. Alastair, reading the letter at the small round table in the smaller dining room, set it down and said, quietly, "This is a scouting party. You need not receive her. I can write and say the date is inconvenient." And Clara, who had been thinking about the letter for the whole of the morning since Mrs. Hollis brought it in, said, "No. Let her come." Alastair looked at her. Clara said, "Let her come here. Let her come, alone, to a house where she is the outsider and I am not. Let her come without the audience of London around her. Let her look at me across a small round table with a fire behind me and no one watching. It will not be as she expects." Alastair, looking at Clara across the small round table, said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "You are, I discover, formidable." And Clara said, "I am not." But she was. Ophelia Ashcombe arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of April. She was tall and slender, and possessed of a fashionable pallor and a dress the exact color of ripe damson plums, and she was accompanied by an elderly cousin acting as chaperone, whom she treated as if the cousin were furniture. She sat down in the small blue drawing-room and she accepted tea, and she looked around the room with the slow appraising look of a person who is calculating the resale value of the objects in it, and she said, at length, "What a very intimate room. Not what one associates with Ravensmere." And Clara, who had, at Aunt Cordelia's instruction, been drinking her tea slowly, said only Ravensmere has many rooms. Ophelia smiled. Ophelia said, "It must have been such a surprise to find yourself here. Such a very great, sudden, unlooked-for surprise." And Clara said, "It has been a great pleasure to find myself here." Ophelia said, "I hear you are from Northamptonshire." Clara said, "Yes." Ophelia said, "I do not think I know Northamptonshire." Clara said, "Very few of the fashionable do." And Ophelia, whose smile did not slip but whose eyes narrowed by 1/8 of an inch, understood at that moment that the young woman opposite her was not going to give her the entertainment she had driven 40 miles to receive. She adjusted. She said more directly, "I am told the Duke's fortnight in the country was, at the last, an eventful one. I do not wonder that he came away with a wife. I do wonder sometimes at the way of it." Clara set her cup down. She said, quite quietly, "Lady Ophelia, you have driven a long way. I hope your journey was not too tiring." And Ophelia said, "It was not tiring at all. I do not tire easily." And Clara said, "No, I did not think you did." And they looked at each other across the small blue drawing room for a moment that neither of them, in memory afterward, would ever be entirely able to describe, and Lady Ophelia Ashcombe, who had come to Ravensmere expecting to find a small figure in a grey dress, understood that the figure was in the grey dress but was not small, and adjusted her plans accordingly. She stayed a further quarter of an hour, on the strict edge of politeness. She admired the roses. She said something conventional about the West Lawn. She accepted a second cup of tea and did not drink it, and she rose to go, and at the door of the small blue drawing room, with her cloak already about her shoulders, she turned and said, as if by afterthought, "I look forward to the ball, Your Grace. All of London does. I hear it will be a great crush. So many people. So many faces." And Clara, at the door, said only, "I look forward to receiving you." And Ophelia was gone. And Louisa, who had been listening from the small room adjoining, came in the moment the carriage was on the drive and said, "That was war." And Clara said, "I know." And Louisa said, "You did very well." And Clara said, "I did what Aunt Cordelia told me. I did not blink." And Louisa laughed, and there was, in her laugh, something Clara had not heard in Louisa before, which was pride. The days between Ophelia's visit and the ball itself were, in the private accounting of Ravensmere, unusually quiet. Clara did not speak of the visit again after that first exchange with Louisa in the anteroom. She did not review it in her head at odd hours. She did not, when she found herself alone in the small blue drawing room in the mornings, look at the settee on which Ophelia had sat and feel any small residual heat from the encounter. She had, in the moment of the visit, understood something about her opponent that she had needed to understand, and she had filed it in the small careful way she filed everything, and she had moved on. Alastair, watching her at the small round table on the evening of the visit, said quietly that she did not seem troubled. And Clara said no. She had taken her measure. She knew what she could do. She knew what she could not do. She did not think, in the end, that what she could do was very much. And Alastair, looking at her across the small round table with an expression she could not entirely read, said that he would not have said any of that at her age. And Clara said that she was 23, that she had been at edges of rooms her whole life, that one learned, from the edges, what the middle looked like, that she had been watching all those years. And Alastair had said nothing for a long moment, and then he had reached across the small round table and taken her hand, and he had said, quietly, that he was grateful for the watching, and that he was more grateful still for her coming into the middle. And Clara had not answered, because there was nothing that needed to be said in answer to that, and they had finished their supper in warm quiet, and the candle had burned down, and the house had gone on preparing for the ball around them without their being required to attend to it. The ball approached. Ravensmere prepared. The ballroom, which had been closed for 6 years since the death of the old Duke, was opened, aired, cleaned, polished, and hung with fresh candles. The long galleries were arranged for supper. The musicians were engaged. The invitations were, at last, all answered. Clara chose her dress, and this was the choice that Aunt Cordelia had told her, months earlier, would matter. She did not choose an elaborate dress. She did not choose a dress that would compete with the great gowns of the London hostesses, or with the fashionable pallor of the damson plum. She chose, after some thought, a gown of a soft, deep green. Not the emerald of a great jewel, not the pale sage of a girl's first ball, but a quiet, deep forest green, the color of the yew tree under which Alastair had, 7 months earlier, offered her his coat in the rain. She had her dark brown hair dressed simply, and coiled. She wore no jewels but a single small strand of pearls that had been Alastair's mother's, and that Alastair, on the morning of the ball, had brought to her in a small worn box and had set around her neck himself, without speech. She looked at herself in the tall mirror in her dressing room. She thought, quite calmly, that she looked like herself. That was, she thought, what she had been going for. The ball began at 9 o'clock. By 10 the ballroom was full. By 11, all of London that mattered had arrived and been announced, and Clara had stood at the head of the room beside Alastair receiving them for 2 hours, and had, without visible effort, remembered every name. Louisa, at her shoulder, had prompted her only twice, and only when a particularly obscure connection required it. Aunt Cordelia, established in a chair of state at the side of the room, had received her share of homage from the older generation and had, once, caught Clara's eye across the room and given her a very small approving nod. Alastair, when he was not receiving, was at Clara's side, and Alastair's manner at the ball was the manner of a man who is entirely, publicly, without ambiguity, at his wife's side. This had not been announced. It had not been performed. It had simply been the case, from the moment they had entered the ballroom together, and Alastair had, in the small pause before the receiving began, taken Clara's hand and held it for a beat longer than necessary before letting it go. All of London had seen him do it. All of London had understood. Lady Ophelia Ashcombe arrived at 11:15, in a gown of white silk shot through with silver threads, which caught the light like moving water, and which was, by the estimation of the room, the most sensational dress in the ballroom that night. She was accompanied by her brother, Lord Edmund Ashcombe, who bowed to Clara with real warmth and shook Alastair's hand with real relief, and who Clara noticed, without particular comment, had grown thinner over the winter. Ophelia curtsied precisely. Ophelia said, precisely, all the things a woman of her rank was expected to say to the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere on the occasion of their first great ball. Ophelia moved on. And she moved, over the course of the next hour, from group to group in the ballroom, and she spoke to a great many people, and at each group Louisa, who was watching from a small distance without seeming to watch, noted the slow ripple of her passage. A small quick glance turned toward Clara, a small quick word covered by a fan, a small quick laugh not entirely stifled. Ophelia was doing what Ophelia had come to do. She was preparing the ground. Clara, at the head of the room, felt the ripple as a kind of heat, and she did not turn her head, and she did not falter, and she went on dancing when it was her turn to dance, and she went on speaking when it was her turn to speak, and she waited. Came at 12:30. The great ball had reached the moment when a great ball reaches a natural pause. The musicians had finished a set, and a general drift toward the supper galleries had begun, and the center of the ballroom was, for a moment, unusually open, and Lady Ophelia Ashcombe, at the far end of the room, raised her voice above the ordinary murmur of the room and said, clearly enough to be heard by every person within 30 feet, I think it is only fair, before we all go into supper, that the truth of a certain matter be known, in the interest of the family whose ball we are enjoying. The room stilled. Ophelia held, in her gloved hand, what appeared to be a folded letter. She said, I have, in this letter, correspondence between a certain gentleman of my acquaintance, of position in Northamptonshire, and the Duchess of Ravensmere prior to her marriage. Correspondence which suggests, I am afraid, that the circumstances of her engagement to the Duke were rather less straightforward than has been generally reported, and that certain matters of honor may not have been observed as they ought. A small hush. Ophelia lifted the letter slightly. She said, I am sorry to raise so painful a subject on so happy an occasion, but I feel it is owed to the Duke, who is my kinsman and my dear friend, that he should not go on any longer under any misapprehension. She let the moment sit. It was a very well-designed moment. It was the moment of a young woman who had rehearsed her attack for 6 months, and who believed that the shape of the ballroom, and the presence of the Duke, and the natural interest of the room, would carry her to her intended effect. She had, in this letter, either a forgery, or a piece of ordinary correspondence contorted out of context, or a real letter of Lord Edmund's own that she had obtained by means her brother did not know about. The specific contents did not, in the end, matter. What mattered was that she had chosen a moment when denial would sound like defense, when silence would sound like guilt, and when the assembled eyes of London society would carry whatever version of the story she chose to tell into every drawing room of the summer. She had not counted on Alistair. Alistair, who had been at the far side of the ballroom in conversation with an older peer, had turned at the sound of Ophelia's raised voice. He was not, when he turned, either angry or hurried. He crossed the room with the same measured pace with which he had done everything Clara had ever seen him do, and he stopped in the center of the floor, near enough to Ophelia to be heard clearly, and he said, in a voice that was quiet and yet reached the walls, "Lady Ophelia, before you continue, I would like to say something." Ophelia, whose smile did not falter but whose grip on the letter tightened by a fraction, said, "By all means, Your Grace." Alistair looked around the ballroom. He did not look at Clara. He looked at the assembled faces, and he waited until the silence was complete. And then, standing in the middle of the ballroom in a plain dark coat that was not much finer, essentially, than the coat he had worn 7 months earlier in the drawing-room at Wexley Hall, the Duke of Ravensmere spoke. He said, "I chose her not for her fortune because she had none. I chose her not for her connections because she had none. I chose her not for her beauty, though it is real, and it is quiet, and I have looked at it every morning for 6 months and been grateful for it. I chose her not for her rank because when I chose her, she did not know I had any. I chose her not for the credit she would bring to my house, though she brings it in every corridor of it, in every ledger, in every tenant's cottage, in every corner where she has passed. I chose her not for any of the reasons the world assumes a man in my position chooses a wife, and I want the world, tonight, to hear it. I chose her because she stood, on a wet evening in October, in the doorway of a small library in her father's house, and she saw me. Not the house behind my name, not the estate, not the 10,000 a year or the seat in the Lords or the acres in Buckinghamshire. She saw a stranger in a plain coat, and she spoke to him about songbirds. I chose her because for a fortnight she went on speaking to me, and for a fortnight I discovered that I had, without knowing it, been invisible in my own life for a great many years, and that the person who saw me was a young woman in a grey dress whom half the fashionable world would have failed to notice at a party. I chose her because when a man of my cousin's rank and manner and fortune offered her, in her father's drawing-room, everything she could reasonably want, she refused him in the quietest possible way, and gave, as her reason, a preference she had not yet allowed herself to name. I chose her because in that moment, in a rain-wet garden 10 minutes later, she trusted me with the truth of her heart before she knew the truth of my name, and I have not, since that moment, been able to imagine a life in which she was not at my side. I chose her because she has done, in 6 months at Ravensmere, more good to this house than any of us who have lived here all our lives have done in a generation. I chose her because she is, in her quiet, capable, unfashionable, unshowy person, precisely the kind of woman a house like this and a name like mine most desperately needs, and because I was fortunate enough to recognize it. I did not choose her for any reason your ladyship's letter can contain. I would ask, if it does not offend you, that you put the letter away." He paused. He said, still in that quiet voice, "And I would ask that any person in this ballroom who has any question about the circumstances of my marriage direct that question to me, personally, in the light of day, at a time and place of my choosing. Not to my wife. Not on the floor of her ball." The silence in the ballroom lasted a full 3 seconds. The silence was broken by Aunt Cordelia. Aunt Cordelia, from her chair at the side of the room, cleared her throat and said, in a voice that carried, "Well-spoken, nephew." And there was a small ripple of a laugh from the older generation, and then a small ripple of applause from the middle generation, and then a great sustained applause from everyone in the room who had ever wanted a moment of this kind and had never seen one. Lady Ophelia Ashcombe stood very still. The letter in her hand was suddenly not a letter. It was a piece of paper. Her brother, Lord Edmund, moved to her side quietly, took her elbow, and murmured something to her that Clara could not hear, and Ophelia, whose color had gone, turned and walked, with a slow control that Clara, in some small unreached corner of herself, could admire out of the ballroom. She did not return. The ball resumed. Clara had not, in the whole of Alistair's speech, moved. She had stood at the head of the room with her hands folded in front of her, and she had listened, and she had not wept, and she had not smiled either, because the speech had not been the kind of speech that called for either, and because she was, in some deep and private way, hearing something she had waited 23 years to hear without having known she was waiting for it. When the applause at last subsided, and the general murmur of a ballroom returning to its ordinary business resumed, Alistair crossed the floor to her, and he did not, in that moment, take her hand, and he did not embrace her, because they were in public, and neither of them was a person who performed. He stopped in front of her. He said, in the very quiet voice he had used in the library at Wexley Hall on the night they had first spoken, "Was that acceptable, Duchess?" And Clara, who had one very small tear at the edge of one very grey eye that she did not intend to allow to fall, said, "It was acceptable, Your Grace." And Alistair said, "Would you dance with me?" And Clara said, "I would." They danced. It was, in the record of the ball afterward, an ordinary dance. It was not a set that anyone had contrived. It was not a waltz, which would have been faster to arrange. It was the first dance of the next set, a slow country dance that had been chosen weeks earlier by the musicians without any reference to what would occur in the middle of the evening, and Alistair took Clara's hand at the head of the set, and they danced the pattern of it from beginning to end, and neither of them spoke, and every eye in the ballroom, without meaning to, was on them, and no one, for the rest of the evening, mentioned Lady Ophelia Ashcombe's name. It was later, after the ball had ended, after the last carriage had gone from the drive, after the musicians had been paid and the candles had been extinguished in the great chandeliers and the housekeeper had gone up to her bed and the house had, at last, sunk into that particular deep silence that a very great house sinks into after a very great occasion, that Alistair and Clara stood together in the small library at the far end of the east corridor, which Clara had, quietly, over the winter, made her own. He had brought a candle. She had brought her shawl. They stood by the window, and they did not sit because they were both too tired, in a way, to sit, and because they wished, both of them, to end the night in the room in which they had first begun to know each other, though the room was in a different house, in a different county, in a different life. Alistair set the candle on the sill. He said, "You have not thanked me for what I said in the ballroom." Clara said, "I do not intend to. What you said in the ballroom did not require thanks. It required only that it be true." Alistair said, "It was true." And Clara said, "I know." And she turned to him, and she said, quite calmly and quite quietly, and without ceremony of any kind, "I love you." And Alistair, who had waited many months to hear this said aloud, said, "I have loved you since the second night of the fortnight in the library. I do not know when you began to love me." And Clara said, "I do not know either. I do not think it matters." And Alistair took her hand, and did not let it go, and did not kiss her, because they were not, either of them, given to performances even in private, and they stood together in the small library for a long time, until the candle guttered, and then they went, at last, to bed. 9 months later, in the second week of a January that was surprisingly mild, Clara Vane, Duchess of Ravensmere, was in the small breakfast parlour at Ravensmere, at a small round table by the fire, in a dress the colour of a soft dove grey, and she was laughing. She was laughing at Aunt Cordelia, who had come up from the Dower House through the mud in her old carriage because she had, as she said, an urgent thing to convey. She was laughing at Louisa, who had brought in the letter that had prompted the visit, and who was reading it aloud with a mocking London accent that was, Louisa admitted, unfair to the actual sender. The letter was from Lord Edmund Ashcombe. Lord Edmund had, in the course of the summer following the ball, become engaged, and had, in the autumn, married, and his wife was a young widow of moderate fortune and considerable warmth, and Lord Edmund's letter, which was addressed to my cousin the Duchess and was written in the plainest possible language, thanked her for a kindness her own household had shown to a tenant of his in some small matter, and closed by mentioning that his sister Ophelia had, of her own accord, quitted London the previous summer and gone abroad, and was now settled, of all places, in a small town in Switzerland where she gave, so Lord Edmund understood from her rare letters, music lessons. Louisa, reading this, said music lessons and looked at Clara over the top of the letter, and Clara said, "Do not be unkind, Louisa," and Louisa said, "I am not being unkind. I am being amazed." And Aunt Cordelia said, "The world reshuffles itself. It does that. It is why one must be patient." And they were all quiet a moment, and Aunt Cordelia poured herself another cup of tea, and the door of the small breakfast parlour opened, and Alistair came in, with a small woolen bundle in his arms. The small woolen bundle was, in the private accounting of Ravensmere, of 6 weeks' age and unquestionable importance. She was a daughter. She had been given the names Eleanor Cordelia Whitmore Vane, and she was, at 6 weeks, a serious and observant infant with dark hair like her mother's and eyes that had not yet decided their color, and she was, at that particular moment, awake. Alistair set her carefully into Clara's arms. Clara looked down at her a long moment. She said, without looking up, the stable boy said, "The day we came here, that the tenant at Little Marsh had a crippled dog who was still living, and would be pleased to see me. I have been meaning for 6 weeks to go." Alistair, who had learned by then not to be surprised by the connections his wife made between one subject and another, said, "We will go this week." Louisa said, "I will drive you." Aunt Cordelia said, "You will take my carriage, it is warmer." And Clara said, "Thank you." And she looked down at her daughter, who was looking at the fire, and she said quietly, "More to the child than to any of them, you were seen. Even when you thought you were invisible. I want you to know that. That is what this house is for now." And Alistair, standing behind her chair with one hand on the back of it, said, "That is what this house is for now." And they all sat quietly by the fire for a while, and the fire crackled, and the mild January sun came through the window and fell on the floor, and Eleanor Cordelia Whitmore Vane, aged 6 weeks, decided, in her own private accounting, to fall asleep. If you enjoyed the quiet fire of this story, wait until you meet the young governess who wore her mother's mended shawl to a Yorkshire manor house and, on her first evening there, refused to laugh at the master's gardener. The gardener, of course, being the Earl himself, testing the woman who had been sent to teach his ward. That story is coming soon on this channel. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.